Hi everybody, I'm Laurie Voss, my pronouns are he and him, and I'm a data evangelist at Netlify, which means that I look at data and then I give conference talks about it. You may recognize me from when I worked at NPM, where I looked at data and gave conference talks about it. The data that I'm talking about today is about the Jamstack, eCommerce, and Europe. We have a lot of data about how developers work, and by looking at that data, we can give you a sense of where you are. Is the stuff that you're working on cutting edge, or is it obsolete? Are you finding your tools hard to work with because few people use them for this purpose, or are you working with best-in-class tools? This kind of information can help you make technical choices and accelerate your team, or it can just make you feel warm and fuzzy because you already made the right choices. We get this data from a lot of sources. The first and most important of those is you. Over the last 2 years, we've had over 10,000 survey responses from developers to our State of the Jamstack survey, which, by the way, we will be running again in 30 days, so please participate. We asked people about the tools that they use and what they use them for. Also, at Netlify, we are able to see what millions of developers are building every single day, so that gives us a sense of where trends are going. Finally, I did a lot of research into public data sets to get a bunch of other stats. So let's start by talking about where we are in general, what we found about the Jamstack community in general, the global trends, before we zoom in on Europe and then on e-commerce in Europe in particular. A quick aside before I start is that I'm going to be using the phrase the average developer a lot in this talk, and in addition to being a web developer, I'm also a statistician, so it pains me to say average when I mean median. But median tends to confuse people, so when I say average, rest assured I mean it in the vernacular sense of the typical developer and not a strict mathematical sense. You'll see why that's important in the very next slide. Worldwide, the average Jamstack developer has 6 years of experience, by which I mean 50% of developers right now have less than that and 50% have more than that. That's not so useful to know, but that experience data becomes more interesting when we further split it by geographical region. What we found is that the Jamstack community is getting more diverse in terms of where in the world we are. Developers who have 15 or more years of experience, people who've been doing the Jamstack for a long time, are mostly inside Europe and North America. They come from outside those places only about 15% of the time. But the newest developers, the ones who have less than a year of experience, they come from outside those two major markets 48% of the time. That is a huge shift. And with geographical diversity, we can hopefully see other kinds of diversity improve as well. There's also been a huge shift to remote work globally, obviously as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously, lots of developers went remote during the pandemic, but nearly a third say that their job not only went fully remote in the pandemic, but it's going to stay that way permanently. That trend is even more pronounced among more experienced developers, with the permanently remote number climbing to 40% when you look at developers who have 2 or more years of experience. That's important to us today because, as we're going to see shortly, European developers are more experienced. Another important global finding is the importance of mobile devices, or rather, the confusing lack of it. 84% of devs say that desktop browsers are a very important target for them. But only 71% say the same of phones. That's confusing because, as we're going to see, the traffic data is the other way around. For the majority of sites, and even more so in the e-commerce space, the majority of traffic is coming from mobile devices. But the data says that we are not yet taking that reality seriously. Our global data asked a lot of technical choices, so I'll give you some highlights. First, let me explain about this kind of graph that you're about to see. This is a graph of usage on the x-axis versus satisfaction. A satisfaction score of 1 means that users are exactly as likely to say that they want to use something more as they are to say they want to use it less. Under 1, they want to use it less. They want to stop using it. Over 1, they want to use it more. If you're off to the right of this graph, people use you a lot. If you're off to the left of this graph, people don't use you so much. So now let's look at the market for content management systems. You can see that WordPress is a huge deal, both to serve content and used as a headless API. People like using the API version. Its score is over 1, but the regular version has very low satisfaction. People are trying to move away from it. The top 5 CMSs globally in terms of usage are WordPress, Contentful, Strapi, Sanity, and Drupal. As we're going to see later, there are some subtleties to that data. A more surprising finding for us was that serverless functions have already passed the early adopter phase. They are used by nearly half of all developers, and this is the 2021 data. We are about to run the 2022 survey, like I said, and we expect to see serverless usage has jumped well into the majority. It also has enormous satisfaction. People love using serverless functions. Now let's talk about frameworks. There's so many frameworks, we have to split them up a bit. So let's start with basic component frameworks. Here the story is unsurprising. React dominates. 67% of people say that they are using React. For Vue, that number is in the mid-30s, and Svelte is much smaller, but it's gaining. In the more full-featured frameworks, which I call kitchen sink frameworks, the leader is currently Next.js. It is at over 40% share, and its satisfaction is very high. Next.js is also doing very well, and SvelteKit is something to look out for. In the category of frameworks used for generating static sites, the picture is more complicated. The favorite by usage is Gatsby, but its satisfaction is declining. The favorite by popularity, by satisfaction, is Eleventy, but its usage was, at least in 2021's data, still pretty small. So we're looking forward to seeing how this picture changes in our 2022 dataset. So that is the global picture. Now let's zoom in on where we are, Europe, and then e-commerce in Europe in particular. The first thing to know about e-commerce in Europe is that it is an enormously big deal. In 2021, the European e-commerce market was $660 billion, and there are over 500 million e-commerce shoppers in Europe, and they spend an average of nearly $1,000 a year. This is an enormous market. It is a great place to be in business. It is also a mature market. In the UK, 80% of people shop online. In Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, and Sweden, those percentages are all in the 70s. That is a double-edged sword. It means there's lots of customers already out there, but it also means they've already picked a place to shop. It means that e-commerce in Europe is highly competitive. You don't just need to have the best products, you need to have the best shopping experience. And we're going to talk about what a shopping experience means right at the end. And the last part of the big picture is the effect of COVID. It dramatically accelerated the shift to online shopping, and so far, that shift has been persistent. With the current economic turbulence and geopolitical situation, it's unclear if these projections will hold up, but so far they have. So that's the playing field. Now, who are the players? It turns out that European developers are meaningfully different from the average developer around the world, and e-commerce developers are also not the same as developers who work on other types of sites. So let's look at the data for both. Start with the demographics. I said that Europe is a more mature market, and so are its developers. Literally, the average developer in Europe has more development experience than developers in other markets. An interesting difference is that European developers are also more likely to be contractors than in other markets. On average around the world, 10% of developers say that they work as contractors, but in Europe, that percentage is 15%. That is probably related to another change we saw, which is that you are 10% more likely to be working remotely than your peers elsewhere if you work in Europe. That's true even after the global shift to remote work as a result of COVID. And these trends feed into each other. And also into another tendency that we noticed, which is that the type of sites that European developers work on are noticeably different. We saw meaningfully greater concentrations in people building B2B, e-commerce, obviously, internal sites, and lead capture sites. European developers seem to be more business-focused than their peers elsewhere. And the final demographic trend that I spotted is that European developers were earlier to the Jamstack and are more enthusiastic about the Jamstack. European developers reported starting working on Jamstack sites an average of 6 months earlier than their peers around the world. And having started earlier, European devs seem to really have enjoyed the experience because they also build Jamstack sites more frequently. 44% of European developers say that they usually or always build Jamstack sites. That is 15% more than the average developer around the world. And of course, it's a good sign for the Jamstack in general that the people who've been doing it for a long time continue to be very enthusiastic about it. So that is developers in Europe. What about e-commerce developers? It turns out those are different too, and ways that intuitively make sense. The most important difference for e-commerce developers is that you, are less likely to roll your own backend. You're more likely to call yourself a front-end developer for starters, but you also report using third-party services more frequently across the board. Content management systems, asset management APIs, headless commerce APIs, obviously, and databases as a service, you are meaningfully more likely to use those services than developers who build other types of sites. Another meaningful difference that we spotted is that you work on sites that serve larger numbers of people. 40% of e-commerce developers say that they work on sites that serve audiences in the millions of people, and that is more than people who build other types of sites. And related to both of those last two is that you are more likely to use serverless functions. Serverless functions are a great scaling technique, and also they mean that you don't have to maintain your own backend, and they play really well with third-party APIs. So when you combine these trends into e-commerce developers in Europe, what is it that we see? European developers were ahead of the game in adopting the Jamstack. They did it because it fitted their working style, and they like combining third-party services to be able to ship quickly. And they're looking for low-maintenance solutions because they're frequently contractors. They're also going for performance because the market is mature and competitive, and because they are more experienced and they know what they're doing. So that's all good to know, and there are already some hints just in this demographic data of what best practices are going to look like. But we also have a bunch of data about technology choices, so let's go into that. The first best practice is obvious. Your goal is commerce. You are trying to make the best user experience for your customers. You are not trying to break new ground in software development. That is a completely reasonable and defensible position for this market. Across the board, European commerce developers use content management systems more often. They were not more likely to use any particular CMS, they were just more likely to use CMSs than other people. And so the top 5 are the same: WordPress, Contentful, Strapi, Drupal, and Sanity. But it is notable that PHP-based solutions are in the decline, both in usage numbers and when we asked about satisfaction levels. Older systems like WordPress and Drupal are losing ground to newer systems, although the picture becomes more complicated due to the popularity of the API-only version of WordPress. As you'd expect from an industry prioritizing performance, static site generators frameworks are very popular. We saw lots of enthusiasm for Eleventy, for Gatsby, for Gridsome, and Nuxt, for some reason, is more popular in Europe than elsewhere, along with its accompanying framework, VuePress. A more surprising finding was the indication that European commerce developers are more likely to be building multi-channel approaches. Alongside your commerce offerings, you're more likely to be building news and entertainment content, social content, and streaming video content of various kinds. That was a surprise to me, but in retrospect, it's what you would expect in a highly competitive and mature market. You're not just building stores, you're capturing attention with great experiences. You are differentiating yourself as a place to spend time and not just a place to spend money. That is what the data says. And our final technical finding is that mobile first is true across the industry, but it is doubly true in e-commerce. In the UK, 60% of all e-commerce transactions happen on mobile devices, and the number is over 50% in a dozen other markets. All the other trends we've seen are arguably being driven by this trend. If you need performance, you're going to need to go for pre-rendered content. You're going to want a CDN. You're going to want an optimized API and systems that are resistant to sudden bursts in traffic. All of that points to the Jamstack and to serverless functions on top of that. So that is a lot of information and a lot of statistics to absorb all at once. So let me see if I can boil that down into some easy to remember takeaways. First, focus on shipping. You don't need to roll your own, just pull in an API. That's how it's done, that's how everyone is doing it. Second, go static first. You want performance and mobile performance in particular, and that says that you should be going with a static first approach. Finally, if you haven't already, now is the time to be looking at serverless solutions. As a solution for performance and scale while providing the personalized, dynamic experiences that a competitive market demands, serverless functions can really help you out. I hope that this has been a useful look at how data can shape your tactics and your technical choices. If you've got any questions, feel free to ask me on Twitter or one of the many friendly Netlify folks at our conference booth. Thanks, and I hope you have a great conference and a great rest of your day. Bye.